What if one disaster on a small Atlantic island reshaped the population of half the Western world? What if a single crop failure didn't just starve a nation, but changed the identity of countries thousands of miles away? The Irish Famine, Ungor Timor, the Great Hunger, was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point in global history. Between 1845 and 1851, Ireland experienced one of the most lethal humanitarian crises in modern times. 1 million people died. Another million fled. In just 6 years, a quarter of the country disappeared. But the famine didn't stay within Irish borders. It spilled outward, across oceans, across continents. It reshaped cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, Melbourne, and Toronto. It altered the politics of the United Kingdom. It transformed the cultural DNA of North America. It created new communities, new tensions, new identities, and left scars that are still visible today. Today, in the United States alone, more than 40 million people claim Irish heritage. In Canada and Australia, entire communities trace their beginnings to the ships that carried desperate families away from hunger. For millions around the world, the story of the famine is not distant history. It is family history. The moment their ancestors stepped onto a new shore was often the moment they left the famine behind. But why was the Irish catastrophe so severe? Why did a potato disease in Ireland kill so many more people than the same blight did in continental Europe? And how did political decisions, economic ideology, and prejudice turn a natural crisis into one of the deadliest famines of the 19th century? To answer that, we have to return to the very beginning, to the first signs of the strange new disease that would reduce Ireland's staple food to blackened, inedible pulp. A warning that went ignored until it was far too late.
History is not just the past. It is the greatest story ever told. From the rise of mighty empires to their fiery collapse, history has shaped the world in ways that continue to amaze us. From warriors who carved kingdoms to revolutions that changed the course of civilization, every moment holds a story worth remembering. From ancient wonders like the Great Wall and Da Vinci's timeless sketches to humanity reaching for the stars with the Apollo 11 mission, the journey of mankind is nothing short of extraordinary. This channel brings history to life through fast-paced stories, cinematic storytelling, and epic journeys across time. We explore battles, betrayals, inventions, and legends, the defining moments that shaped who we are today. If you have ever wanted to see history as if you were truly there, you have found the right place. Step into the past, relive the greatest stories ever lived, and join our journey through time. Subscribe now.
The summer of 1845 began like any other in rural Ireland. Fields were green, families tended their small plots, and the potato, the one crop that kept millions alive, seemed healthy and strong. But whispers had already begun drifting across the continent. Reports from Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of northern France spoke of a strange plague attacking potatoes. Farmers described how healthy crops seemed to rot overnight, leaves wilting into a ghostly black, the stench of decay drifting across entire fields. By September, those whispers became reality in Ireland. Farmers walked into their potato fields and found devastation. Plants that had looked vibrant days earlier now hung limp and blackened, as if burned from within. When the farmers dug into the soil, what they saw was far worse. Potatoes turned to foul-smelling sludge, collapsing at the slightest touch. A full year's food supply gone. The culprit was an organism barely visible to the human eye, Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight. At the time, no one understood its nature or its spread. All the Irish farmers knew was that the one crop they depended on had suddenly betrayed them. Crop failures had happened before. Ireland had endured food shortages in the 17th and 18th centuries, and tens of thousands had died in previous blight years. But in 1845, no one imagined the scale of what was coming. They hoped it would pass quickly. that it would be confined to a few unlucky counties, that next season would be better. But the blight was relentless. It moved like a shadow across the island, from the south and east toward the west, the region where Ireland's poorest families lived on small, subdivided plots. Nearly half of Ireland's population depended almost entirely on the potato. For more than 2 million Irish people, it wasn't just food, it was survival. On 1 acre of poor soil, potatoes were the only thing that could provide enough nutrition to keep a family alive through brutal winters. Even when the harvest was good, life was fragile. When it failed, families had nothing. At first, the government in London watched with measured concern. Crop diseases were common, and many expected this one to pass. But as reports multiplied, as the blight tore through farm after farm, it became clear that Ireland was facing an unprecedented disaster. The first year of the blight was only the beginning. Over the next seasons, the fungus returned again and again, each attack more devastating than the last. But while the blight may have been the spark, it was not the true cause of the catastrophe that followed. The real disaster, the one that killed 1 million people, grew out of centuries of land inequality, political indifference, economic ideology, and decisions made far from the fields where Irish families starved. To understand why Ireland suffered so much more than the rest of Europe, we have to look at who controlled the land and who was allowed to eat from it. To understand why Ireland suffered so brutally while other European countries endured the same blight with far fewer deaths, we have to look at the system beneath the soil, the centuries-old structure of land ownership that left millions of Irish people balanced on the edge of survival long before the famine began. For generations, Ireland had been a colony under British rule. Through a long history of confiscations, plantations, and conquest, most of the island's fertile land had been taken from native Irish families and handed to wealthy landlords, many of them English or descendants of English settlers. These landlords controlled the best fields, the richest pastures, and the most profitable farmland. The Irish poor, by contrast, were pushed to the least fertile corners of the island, places where thin soil and rocky ground made large-scale farming almost impossible. A typical peasant family had a tiny plot, sometimes barely an acre or two. These plots were subdivided again and again over generations as land passed from father to sons, shrinking with time until families were trying to survive on what amounted to scraps. Under these conditions, the potato became not just a crop, but the foundation of life. Unlike grain, which required better soil, or livestock, which required more land, potatoes could grow on marginal ground and provide an astonishing amount of nutrition. A man, woman, and several children could live almost entirely on potatoes and milk. It was simple, reliable, and incredibly efficient, until the blight arrived. This made Ireland uniquely vulnerable. In Belgium, Germany, and France, the potato was an important food source, but not the only one. Farmers still had access to wheat, barley, oats, and livestock. In Ireland, millions of people had no such backup. They had one crop, one chance, one lifeline. And when that lifeline snapped, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. But land alone didn't explain the scale of the suffering. The structure of Irish tenancy made survival almost impossible once the blight struck. Most Irish farmers didn't own the land they worked. They rented it, often at extremely high rates. Many landlords didn't even live in Ireland. They were absentee owners living in London or elsewhere in England, collecting rent from a country they scarcely saw. When the potato crop rotted in the fields, these tenants couldn't pay their landlords. And when they couldn't pay, they were evicted. Thousands of families were driven from their homes in the early famine years, their belongings tossed onto the roadside, roofs sometimes torn down to prevent them from returning. Many took to the roads as wandering beggars. Others crowded into overcrowded workhouses where disease spread like wildfire. Many simply died where they fell. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't unavoidable. It was the predictable result of a system built on inequity, a system where the poorest people were forced onto the poorest land, given no security, and expected to survive on almost nothing. The blight had exposed a truth that had been building for centuries. Ireland wasn't just facing a crop failure, it was facing the collapse of a deeply unjust social order. And yet, even as the crisis grew, the government in London made decisions that transformed a natural disaster into a historic catastrophe. The famine became deadly not only because of what happened in the fields, but because of what happened in the halls of power. When the first crop failed in 1845, hope still lingered that the British government would step in with decisive help. After all, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. In theory, its suffering was Britain's responsibility. And at first, there were signs of action. Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, who had seen crises in Ireland before, reacted quickly. He authorized the importation of cheap grain from overseas, secret shipments of Indian corn, known as Peel's brimstone, to be sold at reduced prices to the starving. He organized limited public works projects to provide wages so the poor could buy food. These measures weren't perfect, but they were a start. Then, everything changed. In 1846, Peel's government fell, replaced by the Whig Party under Lord John Russell. And with that shift, a humanitarian crisis collided with rigid political ideology. The Whigs believed passionately in the free market, the idea that government should not interfere with trade, prices, or private enterprise. To them, any form of government aid risked distorting the economy. At the same time, many in the British ruling class viewed the Irish poor as backward, lazy, or even morally flawed. These stereotypes hardened into policy. The man put in charge of famine relief, civil servant Charles Trevelyan, became the embodiment of this mindset. He saw the famine not as a catastrophe requiring massive intervention, but as a sort of divine correction, a harsh cleansing. He wrote openly that the famine was the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, meant to reduce Ireland's surplus population. Policies built on such beliefs had consequences measured in corpses. When asked to stop the export of food from Ireland, a step other European countries took immediately, the government refused. Protecting free trade, they argued, was more important. And so, as the poor starved, ships continued to leave Irish ports carrying grain, cattle, poultry, butter, oats, and barley, all perfectly edible, all bound for markets in England. Millions of tons of food left Ireland during the worst years of the famine. Historians still debate whether feeding the Irish with these exports would have saved everyone, but nearly all agree it would have saved hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, the government insisted that any aid must be earned. The starving were put to work on massive construction projects, roads that led nowhere, walls that enclosed nothing, piers that never touched water. Men who hadn't eaten properly in weeks were forced to break stones for 12 hours a day in the rain, snow, and cold. Many collapsed and died on the job. Even worse were the workhouses, overcrowded, disease-ridden institutions where families were separated the moment they entered. Conditions were so harsh that many saw death on the roadside as a kinder fate. In 1847, a year without blight, the government declared the famine effectively over. Relief programs were shut down, even though the poor had eaten their seed potatoes the year before and had nothing left to plant. Starvation surged once again. Only when the bodies piled too high to ignore did the government reopen aid and establish soup kitchens. Thousands of lives were saved, but too far too late. The famine dragged on until 1851, long after the policies that could have prevented mass death had been abandoned or ignored. What made the Irish famine not just a tragedy, but a profound injustice was simple. The food existed. The ships existed. The relief plans existed. What was missing was the political will to use them.
But as Ireland starved, its people began to move, not by choice, but by necessity. And that movement reshaped countries across the world. By the late 1840s, Ireland was no longer just a nation in crisis, it was a nation on the move. Families who had survived the early famine years now faced another slow killer: hopelessness. Their farms were gone, their seed was gone, their savings gone, and eviction loomed like a shadow. For many, there was only one option left: leave. The Irish exodus began as a desperate trickle and became a tidal wave. Between 1845 and 1855, more than 2 million people left Ireland, half of them during the famine years, the rest shortly after. Entire villages emptied, roads filled with people carrying whatever they still possessed. Parents sold everything they owned for a chance to buy passage on what became known as coffin ships. These ships earned their name for good reason. Packed far beyond capacity, with little food, no sanitation, and rampant disease, mortality rates often reached 15 to 20%. On some voyages, a third of the passengers never reached land. Yet even with these odds, thousands still boarded because staying behind meant starvation. The destinations varied, but the impact was universal. America, a nation transformed. No country was shaped more profoundly by the famine than the United States. Nearly 1 million Irish arrived in America between 1846 and 1855 alone. They disembarked in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, exhausted, penniless, and often despised. In cities like New York and Boston, anti-Irish sentiment peaked. Signs reading, "No Irish need apply," were common. Political cartoons mocked them. Employers refused to hire them. But slowly, defiantly, the Irish carved out a place for themselves. They built roads, worked in factories, joined the police and fire departments, and entered politics in massive numbers. By the early 20th century, Irish Americans were among the most influential ethnic groups in the country. Today, more than 40 million Americans claim Irish ancestry, a staggering number for a country Ireland's size. Canada. Heroism and heartbreak. Canada received thousands of famine refugees, many landing in Quebec after brutal Atlantic crossings. In 1847, fever spread through the immigrant sheds, killing thousands. Yet local Canadian doctors, nurses, priests, and volunteers cared for them, often at the cost of their own lives. Memorials in places like Gros Isle stand today as symbols of sacrifice and solidarity. Australia. Forced and free migration. Some Irish were transported as prisoners. Others arrived as assisted migrants, encouraged by British authorities who saw emigration as a way to reduce Ireland's burden. Many of these immigrants became the backbone of early Australian communities. Britain, a complicated neighbor. Britain received more than 1 million Irish during the famine era. Cities like Liverpool, London, and Glasgow saw their populations swell. Tensions rose. Cultures clashed. But over generations, the Irish became deeply woven into the fabric of British society, even as the famine left political wounds that would influence Irish-British relations for more than a century. When the famine finally ended in 1851, the Ireland that remained was unrecognizable. 1 million dead, 1 million gone, countless villages deserted, a haunting silence across fields that once fed families for generations. Ireland's population never recovered. Before the famine, it stood at over 8 million. Today, even nearly 2 centuries later, it has still not returned to that number. The trauma of the famine shaped everything that came after: resistance movements, demands for land reform, the rise of nationalism, and eventually the long struggle for independence. The famine became part of Ireland's collective memory, passed from parent to child in stories filled with grief,
resilience, and quiet rage. Across Ireland today stand countless memorials, bronze sculptures of gaunt families reaching toward ships that will take them away, fields of unmarked graves where victims were buried hurriedly, abandoned cottages, their roofs long gone, left exactly as they were when families fled. These ruins are not simply historical sites, they are ghosts. A disaster that redefined the world. The Great Famine was not just an Irish tragedy, it was a global turning point. It reshaped demographics on multiple continents. It altered the cultural identities of entire nations. It forced the world to rethink how governments should respond to hunger, poverty, and crisis. It exposed the deadly consequences of political ideology placed above human life. And it left behind a profound truth. The famine changed Ireland, but it also changed the world Ireland helped build. From the skyscrapers of New York to the suburbs of Melbourne, from the streets of Boston to the pubs of Toronto, the descendants of famine survivors carry their ancestors' story within them. A story of endurance, of loss, of survival against impossible odds. The Irish famine was one of history's darkest chapters, but the people who lived through it and those who carried their legacy to new shores reshaped the world in ways that still echo through our time.